Hi, welcome to part 2 in my lecture series on community-based social marketing. Here I'll be talking about selecting a behavior. And there is a process to this. The behavior you select should be a non-divisible end state behavior. What does that mean? Well, it's non-divisible if it's specific. Maybe I want people to be more eco-friendly. Well, there's lots of ways people can do that. That leaves a lot of room for interpretation. How about reduce your plastic use? That's more specific. But still, there are so many ways people can reduce their plastic use. So how about bring your own shopping bag, reusable shopping bag? That specifically targets the single-use disposable plastic grocery bags. Next, a behavior should be an end state, reflecting the final behavior step. If I want people to recycle more, I might say find your recycling bin. That's a good suggestion, but it doesn't mean people will actually use it. Rather, use your recycling bin. Of course, they need to find it first, but if I can get them to use it, then they will have used it. But, of course, people often use recycling bins inappropriately. They throw in things that can't be recycled or are contaminated with food waste. That creates problems. So how about drop clean recyclables in the bin? Now we're getting to an end state behavior where if people do it, then they will have recycled correctly. At least there's a greater likelihood. Next, in choosing behaviors, we need to evaluate if a behavior is a good one to target on some criteria. First, there should be minimal prior adoption. If everyone's already doing it, then what's the point in promoting it? We can learn about prior adoption through observing a target audience or through conducting a survey, right? So we can observe them unobtrusively by watching what items people throw in a recycling bin. Or we can ask them about that in a survey. Of course, surveys are limited because people often say how they would prefer to behave rather than how they actually behave. Next, behavior should have maximal impact, and there should be a good probability that people will adopt it. You can learn about impact through studying the behavior or through consulting with experts. And then you can learn about probability through case studies or prior campaigns, seeing what behaviors were actually adopted. You can also talk to people, survey them to get a sense of which behaviors they would adopt given some motivation. So I'm going to give an example of this with recycling. Maybe I want people to recycle steel cans. Well, we can get some data on this from the National Environment Agency. In 2024, the steel recycling rate was 99%. So not much room for improvement. I would say the prior adoption rate is too high. It's maybe not that consumers are recycling, but the steel gets recycled in the end, at least by the waste collectors. Not much room for improvement. So let's say nah. If we look elsewhere in the data from NEA, we see ash and sludge has a recycling rate of 14%. A lot of room for improvement. What's the probability of individual consumers like you and me adopting this? I would say it's near zero. Ash and sludge sounds like something industries deal with. It's not something individual consumers have control over. All right, so let's not look at ash and sludge. How about plastic? The recycling rate in 2024 was 5%. It's been on a decline over about the past decade. I would say the probability of adoption is moderate. It's something consumers know how to do, they've done in the past, and maybe with a little bit of motivation or simplification, they would do it. All right, so what's the potential impact? Well, if you look at all the different waste streams and which ones generate the most waste that isn't recycled, plastic is number one. More kilograms of plastic end up being incinerated and sent to Singapore's only landfill. More plastic than any other waste category. So plastic is a good one to target. Now let's think about a non-divisible end state behavior. I'm going to kind of repeat myself here. Waste less plastic, right? That's rather divisible. How do we make it more specific? All right, find the bin nearest home. Again, you know this is problematic because it's not an end state. That doesn't mean people will recycle. Rather, find the bin and always use it to dispose of clean recyclables. Now we're getting more into the territory of a good non-divisible end state behavior. I'm going to give an example of how to look at prior adoption, probability, and impact to choose among multiple competing target behaviors. I have an Excel sheet here. Let me pull this up. So what you can see is I want to do a campaign on energy conservation, and I've decided 3 ways people can save energy is by taking cold showers, air drying their laundry, and using a fan instead of aircon. So we can evaluate these based on some assumptions. You can see my assumptions are here. And we can start entering numbers. For example, how many minutes per day does somebody take a hot shower? I'm making these numbers up, but let's say it's 15 minutes. Let's say they do 2 dryer loads of laundry per week, and there's 8 hours of aircon every day. Now let's look at the adoption, the percent of people who currently take cold showers. I'm going to put this at, let's say it's pretty low, 30%. Who air dry their laundry. I think that's somewhat moderate here in Singapore. Maybe 50% of people do that. Use only a fan. I'm going to put that a little lower, let's say 40%. And what you can see here is 1 minus adoption is the number I'm interested in, right? If very few people have adopted it, 30%, then 1 minus adoption. It's a higher number here, meaning it's better to target. And then let's look at the probability, or the percent of people who would be willing to change their behavior who don't currently perform that behavior. What percent of people would be willing to take cold showers? I'm going to put this at maybe 60%. I'm feeling optimistic. Air dry laundry, I'll put this low because for reasons, I don't know. Again, I'm making these numbers up. And then use only a fan. I'm going to also put this low. People who use aircon when they sleep might be totally addicted to it. And what we can see is this is populated, and these are some, again, made up numbers that show a potential impact that's roughly corresponding to annual energy conservation. And we see using a fan instead of aircon has by far the biggest number here. So based on these assumptions, and based on the numbers I made up, right, I would ideally find good data on these things, I would conclude that using a fan instead of aircon is an ideal behavior to target. Then I would go about articulating a non-divisible end state behavior. But of course, before doing that, I would need to identify potential barriers and benefits to understand why people may or may not use a fan instead of aircon. So I'm going to be talking about that in the next video. Stay tuned.